So picture this. It's the mid-1960s. The Vietnam War is escalating fast, and the US military has a huge problem on its hands. They are desperate for soldiers. And the solution they came up with was quiet, it was radical, and it had devastating consequences that we're still grappling with today.
But not for physical fitness, not for courage or loyalty. No, the standard they decided to change was something else entirely.
Yeah, you heard that right. All of a sudden, tens of thousands of young men, many with significant learning disabilities, men who scored at the absolute bottom of military aptitude tests, were suddenly declared fit for combat. And this wasn't some mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated policy. This is the story of Project 100,000. Okay, so how on earth did this happen? Well, by 1966, the war in Vietnam was a full-blown pressure cooker. The demand for troops was skyrocketing, casualties were piling up, and the existing draft system just couldn't find enough eligible men. The military needed bodies, and they needed them yesterday. So the official answer was a program called Project 100,000. It was pushed through by the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara. And the logic behind it was, well, it was chillingly simple. If you're running out of qualified men, you just lower the bar for what qualified actually means. They slashed the minimum test scores with the goal of bringing in an extra 100,000 men every single year. The military had a very clean, very sanitized name for these recruits: the New Standards Men. Sounds okay, right? But who were these men, really? What did it actually mean to be recruited under this new, much, much lower standard? The reality was just heartbreaking. We're talking about men who could barely read, if they could read at all. They came from backgrounds of deep, grinding poverty, with almost no access to good schools or healthcare. I mean, these were the very men the military had always rejected. But now, with a war to fight, they were suddenly exactly what the Army was looking for. And that really gets to the cold, hard truth of it all. This wasn't some enlightened change of heart about social mobility. The war machine was hungry, and these men were seen as fuel to keep it running. But here's where the story gets even more complicated and kind of cynical. It's how the program was sold to the American public. McNamara didn't get up and say, hey, we're desperate and we're out of options. No. He presented this as a progressive, almost noble social program. He sold it as a social good, an elevator that would lift these men out of poverty. He promised it would teach them discipline, give them valuable job skills, and turn them into responsible citizens. But as you can see, the promise was, well, it was a lie. A battlefield is not a classroom, and this was a one-way ticket to the front line. And you can probably guess what happened next. The second these guys entered the military system, that whole idealistic promise just began to crumble. The unforgiving, high-pressure world of military training was simply not built for them, not even close. I mean, think about it. Basic training is all about learning complex skills under extreme stress. But how can you do that if you can't read the instruction manual for your rifle? Drill sergeants had men who couldn't understand maps or grasp basic weapon safety. And instead of getting the support they needed, they were often ridiculed, punished, and then just pushed through the system. Their destination? The infantry, the front lines, the most dangerous place you could possibly be. And this is absolutely critical. The Vietnam War wasn't like World War II, with clear fronts and objectives. It was a chaotic, ambiguous conflict of ambushes and booby traps, where your survival depended on quick thinking and sound judgment. These were the exact skills these men struggled with, making them a danger not just to themselves, but to everyone in their unit. After the war, researchers started to dig into the data to track what happened to these veterans. And the numbers, well, they tell a devastating story. The true cost of Project 100,000 became painfully, undeniably clear. The program earned a cruel, unofficial nickname among the other soldiers: McNamara's morons. It's a horrible term, but it's important because it tells you everything you need to know about how these men were viewed, as disposable liabilities, not as comrades in arms. And the numbers tragically bear that out. As you can see from this chart, the men from Project 1000 were killed and wounded at a much higher rate than other soldiers. They were sent into the thick of it, and they paid the price. And the tragedy didn't stop when the war ended. It followed them home. A study conducted years later found that these veterans were 2.5 times more likely to die in the years after the war than their peers. The war was over, but for them, the dying wasn't. And remember that promise of a better life, the military as an elevator out of poverty? Well, this table shows you what really happened. Lower lifetime earnings, higher unemployment, higher rates of going to prison, and deeper, more severe mental health problems. The army didn't lift them up. For far too many, it dragged them down even further.
You know, looking back on all this, Project 100,000 really forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable ethical questions about war, about policy, and about who is ultimately responsible when things go horribly wrong. The whole thing leaves us with these really tough questions. Is war ever a legitimate social program? Is it ever okay to knowingly put the most vulnerable people in the most dangerous situations? And why does it always seem that the burdens of war fall heaviest on the shoulders of the poor and the marginalized? And this right here is the core of it. The military knew. They had the data. They knew these men would struggle. They knew they would die at higher rates. And they sent them anyway. So who is responsible for that? This story of Project 100,000 is a dark chapter in history, for sure. But it's more than that. It is a chilling, timeless warning about what happens when a system values numbers over people, when bureaucratic logic replaces a moral conscience, and when a nation at war decides that some of its own people are simply more expendable than others.